The IV drip was still in my arm when he set the bag down by the door. Not my bag, his. I remember staring at it. That gray duffel he'd had since university. The one with the broken zipper he'd always said he'd fix. And thinking, he packed that before we got here. He packed it before we even knew what the biopsy was going to say. "I can't do this," he said. He wasn't crying. That was the part that stayed with me longest. He said it the way you tell someone you can't make it to dinner. Calm. Already decided. I had stage 2 breast cancer, a port in my chest I was still learning not to touch, and a husband who had apparently done the math and found that I didn't add up anymore. He left before the oncologist came back with the treatment schedule. I didn't call anyone that night. I just lay there in the hospital bed, listening to the sounds of the ward. Carts in hallways, a TV somewhere, someone laughing at the nursing station. And I thought about how strange it was that the world just kept going, how it didn't even stutter. My mother came the next morning. I hadn't called her either. The hospital had, apparently, because I was listed as a single patient room and my emergency contact was still my husband, and when they tried to reach him, he didn't pick up. She walked in, took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. She just pulled the chair up to the side of the bed and took my hand and sat there. That was it. That was everything. I found out later that she had driven 4 hours from Sudbury in the dark. We'd been married 3 years, together for 5 before that. I was 31 years old. I had a mortgage in both our names, a dog we'd adopted together, and a diagnosis that apparently made me too inconvenient to love. The thing no one tells you about chemotherapy is how profoundly boring it is. You're so tired you can't read, too nauseated to watch anything loud, and yet somehow also too restless to sleep. You just exist in this gray in-between space for weeks at a time. My mother took a leave of absence from her job without telling me and slept on the pull-out couch in my living room for the first 4 months. My younger sister drove up on weekends. They didn't treat me like I was dying. They treated me like I had the flu and was being slightly dramatic about it, and somehow that was the exact right thing. My husband. I'll call him my ex-husband because that's what he was the moment he picked up that bag. Texted me once, about 6 weeks in. He said he hoped I was doing okay. I read it 3 times. Then I screenshot it and sent it to my sister, who replied with a single emoji I will not repeat here, and I felt genuinely better. I did not respond. The divorce was handled through lawyers. Mine was a woman named Heather who had the energy of someone who had heard every version of this story and found all of them equally unacceptable. She was efficient and unsentimental, and I adored her. The settlement was fair. I kept the house. He kept the dog, which hurt more than I expected. But I was doing 6 rounds of chemo and could barely take care of myself, so it was the right call. I told myself that until I believed it. By the time I finished treatment, I was down 12 pounds, up 1 divorce, and somehow more clear-headed than I had been in years. My oncologist told me I was in remission 9 months after diagnosis. I cried in her office. She handed me a box of tissues and said, "Most people do." I asked her what I was supposed to do now, and she laughed a little and said, "Whatever you want, that's rather the point." I thought about that a lot. Before all of this, I had been working as a mid-level project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company in Ottawa. I was good at my job in the way that people are good at jobs they've never really thought about. Competent, reliable, not particularly passionate. I'd been there 6 years. I had a 5-year plan that involved eventually moving into senior management, getting a bigger place, maybe a dog of my own someday. The plan had involved my husband. The plan had assumed a lot of things. I went back to work 3 weeks after my last scan. My manager, a decent man named Paul, who had sent me a fruit basket during treatment and clearly had no idea what else to do, welcomed me back with a handshake and a kind of careful friendliness that people adopt around illness. Like they're afraid it might be contagious or they might say the wrong thing. I appreciated the effort. I didn't feel like myself there anymore. I wasn't sure I ever had. I started taking courses at night. Project management first, because I already knew it, and then something I'd never admitted to wanting: business strategy. I took a certificate program through the Telfer School of Management at Uadawa, went to class 2 evenings a week, did assignments on the kitchen table with a cup of tea and whatever my mother had left in the freezer from her last visit. I was the oldest person in most of my cohort by about 4 years. I was also, by the end of the first semester, the one the others came to when they were stuck. I finished the certificate in 14 months. I applied for 3 jobs. I got 2 interviews and 1 offer. The company was a mid to large consulting firm, I'll leave the name out, that handled operational strategy for clients in healthcare and public infrastructure. Very Canadian, very practical, not glamorous at all, and I loved it immediately. My new title was Senior Strategy Analyst. It paid 30% more than my old job. My office had a window that looked out at the Rado Canal, which froze in winter, and I used to watch the skateway and think about how much had changed in 2 years. My director was a woman named Elspeth. She was 62, had built her career from nothing in the 90s when the consulting world was not particularly welcoming to women, and she had a specific kind of quiet intensity that I recognized immediately as someone who had survived things and come out the other side with something to prove. She never told me about her personal life. I never asked. But she watched me work for about 6 weeks and then called me into her office and said, "You're underutilizing yourself. I want you on the Halliburton Health account." It was the biggest file in the regional division. I said yes before she finished the sentence. Over the next year, I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life, and I was happy doing it. Genuinely happy, not performing happiness for Instagram happy, but the kind where you're tired at the end of the day in a way that feels earned. Elspeth challenged me constantly and never once made me feel like I needed to be grateful just for the opportunity. She expected me to be excellent. I found that I preferred that enormously to being handled. I bought myself a dog, a 4-year-old rescue greyhound named something unpronounceable that I eventually shortened to Fig. He was neurotic and leggy and slept 17 hours a day, and I loved him completely. I didn't date. I wasn't opposed to it in theory. I just didn't have the bandwidth, and more than that, I didn't particularly want to. I'd spent a year having my body be a medical site, something to be monitored and treated and assessed, and I needed a long time of it just being mine before I wanted to share anything again. I wasn't lonely. I was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely alone in a way that felt like breathing. 2 years, 4 months, and some odd days after he walked out of that hospital room. That's when my ex-husband called. I was in the middle of making pasta when my phone rang. An Ottawa number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. But Fig was looking at me from his bed in the corner with those enormous greyhound eyes that always made me feel vaguely guilty, so I answered just to have something to do with my hands. "It's me." He said it like that. It's me. Like no time had passed. Like me was still a category that required special treatment. I said, "I know," because I did recognize his voice even after everything. "I was hoping we could talk," he said. I looked at the pasta on the stove. About what? He'd moved back to Ottawa, he said. He'd been in Vancouver for a while. Things hadn't worked out the way he'd expected. He said this carefully, like I might ask follow-up questions, and I did not. He'd heard through someone we used to know together that I was doing well, that I was at a new company, that things had changed for me. "They have," I said. "I've changed too," he said. "I know what I did was I know I hurt you. I've done a lot of work on that. I think I was in a really bad place, and I made the worst possible decision, and I've had to live with that." I stirred the pasta. Fig lifted his head. "I'm glad you've done the work," I said. I meant it. I wasn't being sarcastic. I genuinely don't believe in holding people in amber at their worst moment. But I also noticed something happening in my chest. Not the old pain, not anger, not even sadness exactly, more like distance. The clean, earned kind. "I was wondering if we could get coffee," he said. "Just to talk." I said I'd think about it. I got off the phone. I finished the pasta. I didn't think about it much at all. I mentioned the call to Elspeth the next day, not because I needed advice, but because she had become, over the past year, someone I talked to about things. She had that quality some older women have of listening without performing listening, if that makes sense. No head tilting, no mm, mm. Just actual attention. She asked what he wanted. I think he wants back in, I said. She looked at me over her reading glasses. And what do you want? I thought about it. I want him to know what he missed. She smiled at that, not warmly, exactly, more like recognition. What I didn't tell her, what I hadn't told anyone, was that 2 weeks earlier, we had posted a job opening on our company's internal board. Senior Operations Consultant, Regional Division. A strong role, good salary, reporting directly to Elspeth's deputy. And 3 days after my ex-husband called me, his application came through. I found out because the applications came through a shared intake system and my name was on the review committee. I sat with that for a long time. His CV was in my hands, or on my screen, technically, and I could see exactly what had happened to him in the years since he'd left. Vancouver. A startup that hadn't made it. A gap of 8 months. A contract role. Another gap. He was applying for a position 2 levels below what he'd held before everything fell apart. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I've thought about it a lot. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, or if it was a specific kind, the kind that comes not from someone else's failure but from realizing that your own life, the one you had to rebuild from scratch in a hospital bed with a port in your chest and a husband's empty chair beside you, had turned out to be something you were genuinely proud of. The contrast wasn't something I engineered. I hadn't planned any of this. I had just kept going, and going had led me here, and here was good. But I also knew that I was now in a position of some institutional power over someone who had once had all the power in the room between us, and that required me to be very careful about what I did next. I declared a conflict of interest to Elspeth the same afternoon. I told her the applicant was my ex-husband. I told her the circumstances were such that I did not believe I could be objective. I asked to be removed from the review committee for that application. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Are you telling me because you want off the committee or because you want me to know?" I said, "Both." She nodded once. She took me off the committee. She also, I think, looked at his file herself after that, though she never said so directly. He didn't get the job. I don't know all the reasons why. I wasn't in the room, I wasn't consulted, I had nothing to do with the decision. But he didn't get it. He texted me again about 3 weeks later. He'd had an interview at my company, he said. He'd found out after the fact that I worked there. He hoped that hadn't been awkward. I replied, "It wasn't. Good luck with your search." He asked again about coffee. I thought about who I had been in that hospital room and who I was now. I thought about Fig asleep on his bed. I thought about Elspeth handing me the Halliburton file and expecting me to be excellent. I thought about my mother driving 4 hours in the dark without being asked. I thought about all the things I had built in the time he'd been gone, none of which had anything to do with him, none of which required his presence or his approval or his return. I thought about how I used to be afraid of being alone, how being sick had burned that particular fear right out of me, like everything else that wasn't essential. I wrote back, "I don't think coffee would be useful for either of us. I genuinely hope you're well." I put the phone face down on the counter. Fig got up from his bed, crossed the room with his strange, stocky greyhound walk, and pressed his long nose against my knee. "Yeah," I said to him. "Me too." The thing no one talks about when they tell survival stories is the after. The part where the crisis is over and you have to figure out what to actually do with yourself. There's no narrative for that. No one makes movies about the Tuesday 2 years later when you're making pasta and your old life calls and you realize, somewhere between the phone ringing and the water boiling, that you genuinely don't want it back. Not because it was all bad. Not because I don't understand why people try to return to things that once felt like home. but because I had learned, in the hardest way available, that I was capable of building something from nothing. And whatever I had now, the job, the apartment, the canal view, the neurotic greyhound, the mother who drove 4 hours without being asked, the director who expected me to be excellent, was mine, entirely mine. He had missed all of it, every single part of it. And I found, sitting at my kitchen table that night with the pasta going cold in the bowl, that I didn't want to share the ending with someone who hadn't shown up for any of the middle. I used to think that the hardest part of what happened to me was the diagnosis, the word itself, sitting in the air of that exam room like something solid. But looking back now, I don't think that was it. The hardest part was learning, in real time, that the person I had built my life around was capable of picking up a bag he had already packed and walking out while I still had an IV in my arm. That's the thing that required something from me. I didn't know I had. What he did had consequences, not dramatic ones. No courtroom moment, no public reckoning. Just the quiet, accumulating kind. He left, and the world kept moving without him in it, and I kept moving too. And eventually, the distance between who I had been in that hospital room and who I was standing in Elspeth's office became so large that there was simply no bridge back. That's how it works, I think. Not punishment, just physics. Actions move in one direction and time only goes forward, and eventually you end up somewhere neither of you planned. I think about Elspeth a lot when I think about what got me through. She never once treated me like someone who needed to be accommodated. She handed me the hardest file in the division and expected me to handle it, and that expectation, that clear, unsentimental belief that I was capable, did more for me than any amount of gentleness would have. There's something about being held to a high standard by someone you respect that asks you to be more honest with yourself. You can't coast on sympathy. You have to actually show up. I showed up, and somewhere in the showing up, I found out what I was actually made of. That's the part no one can give you or take away. You have to earn it through the doing. I didn't know, before all of this, whether I was someone who could rebuild from nothing. I know now. And knowing it, really knowing it, in the bones, not just as an idea, changes how you move through every room you walk into afterward. I also think about the moment I found his application in that system. I could have done nothing. I could have stayed on the committee and told myself I was being objective. I could have made a quiet phone call, said the right things to the right people. I didn't. I declared the conflict and took myself off, because it was the right thing to do regardless of what he had done to me. My own integrity wasn't something I was willing to trade for the satisfaction of watching him fail in a room I was sitting in. That mattered to me. It still does. The greyhound is asleep at my feet as I write this. My mother called this morning just to talk. The canal will freeze again in a few weeks, and I will watch it from my office window and think, as I always do, about how far I've come from that hospital room. He missed all of it. Every single Tuesday. Every difficult file. Every late night. Every small, ordinary moment that added up to a life I'm proud of. And I find, more and more, that I'm grateful he left when he did, because in leaving, he made space for everything I didn't yet know I was capable of becoming.